Posted by user, Salmon Cubes. Reoccurring encounter? Since childhood. First, I want to say that this may, or may not be, a humanoid encounter. I may just have been dreaming, but if it's the case, I've never had a dream so absolutely lucid or realistic. In my dreams, I'm almost always compelled in my actions, but in this reoccurring situation, I am in full control, and I can feel and smell everything. So, this first came about sometime when I was about 11 or 12 years old, which puts this around 2009 or 2010. I can't really remember which, I just know it was this point when I frequently stayed with my great-grandma, shortly before my great-granddad died of cancer. It was in northwest Georgia, in Chattooga County. Pretty rural, by most standards. Just a couple thousand people around. Anyways, I had been staying with my great-grandparents then, in their rather large house in a very rural neighborhood of about 4 houses, all sparsely spread at the end of a road, somewhat near a nice lake and park. At some time around 1 a.m., I decided to get up from my bed, walk down the long hall to the living room, and get myself a glass of water from the kitchen that basically connects directly to the living room. Walked down the hall as normal, but when I approached the doorless entry to the living room, I instantly felt like something was wrong. It felt like time itself had slowed down, and the moonlight that shined into the living room from our large side windows didn't quite look right. I then understood what was so amiss to me. The lights in the living room were on, but in a way, not so. There was a yellowish light like someone had cut the lights on as normal, but it wasn't the same as what I had always grown up with. It was slightly off. Anyways, I walked a few steps around the corner, thinking I had figured out what was bothering me so much. Well, I was wrong. I turned the corner, and in the midpoint of the room, about 6 or 7 feet from me, was a tall figure in an obscure cloak. To the left and right of him were 2 much smaller figures, but they seemed to disappear as soon as I focused any attention to them. I can't even be sure what they looked like. The smaller ones were the classic grey alien shape that I now am aware of, but whenever I tried to glance to them, they just sort of faded to an indescribable but not their shape. The best way I can describe it is if a shape became the static you would see on a TV screen, or, if they had been drawings, they would have been hastily scribbled in. My eyes darted from the tall figure to them, at which point they sort of disappeared, and then back to the tall figure. This was all I could do before the tall one was alerted seemingly by them disappearing. The tall one was somehow much more unnerving than the other two. When I looked at him from behind, he was incredibly tall, reaching the ceiling. He had to hunch over a small bit in order to not hit his head. That was the strangest thing though. When viewed from behind, his black cloak only extended up to the height of a very tall person, and ended. But when he turned around, he was much taller. It was like his head was totally invisible from behind. Now, the tall one is the biggest thing about this whole story. He turns around, and it's like everything around me just warped. Remember when I said earlier that everything felt wrong or out of place in this general area? It got intensified by several orders of magnitude as soon as he turned around, somehow seemed to gain several feet in height, and look at me. He seemed very surprised that I was there. Sound seemed to completely fade away, but I remember exactly what he smelled like. I couldn't place it then, but after spending the next several months visiting my great-granddad in the hospital and then going to his funeral, I can affirm that it was the smell of death. The kind of smell that you only find in places with people dying. It's very particular. Not a horrible stench, but you can feel its morbidity. It's like it thickens the air. The moment he turned around and looked at me, two things happened. First, I became instantly paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, I could only stand. I didn't feel like I was there, and I couldn't help but think that I shouldn't be there. I had an instant overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there at that exact moment in time, that exact place. Secondly, I saw his face. It was very much like what would be considered the standard grey alien face, although incredibly white. Not a bright white, but an unnaturally white form of white, just dulled a bit. Blemish-free, no hair, no variance in coloration. Had a large conish head, small mouth, small nose holes, etc., but his almond-shaped eyes were absolutely horrifying. I don't think I've ever seen anything remotely as disturbing. They looked like they didn't belong in this plane of existence, like a 2D or 4D object existing in a 3D world. I could only see his face, the rest of what I could assume to be his body still underneath his black cloak. The worst thing came next. He seemed to just look at me in some form of panicked curiosity for a moment or two, with me still paralyzed, literally, in fear. Then, he produced a long arm from the side of his cloak, with thin, elongated fingers. He bent his body towards me, as though one would bend over to pick up something, but bent forward towards me. His mouth seemed to expand impossibly wide for his head. His hand creeped closer to me, and right as it touched my face, I lost consciousness and woke up the next morning. The scariest part of the whole ordeal was what I felt when he saw me. I was sure he was going to kill me, but not in a way you would expect, like getting stabbed or shot. When he saw me, I felt like every part of me would be absolutely annihilated. I'm atheistic, and still was at the time, but it felt like for that one brief moment, I had a soul, and he was going to steal it from me. It's such an immense feeling of dread, thinking that even more than your very life is about to become nothing. When I woke up, everything was not as it was when I had went to sleep or when I had woken up originally to get some water. That is what scares me most to this day, confirming to me that this was not a simple dream. While I had originally went to sleep in my bed in a room down the hall from the living room, I woke up in an obscure position on the living room couch. It was early in the morning, probably about 6 or 7 a.m., judging from the light from outside, so I went back into my bedroom and crawled into bed. It was only after I made it into my bedroom that I remembered what had just happened to me. I became absolutely mortified, covered myself under a blanket, and waited until I heard the sounds of my great-grandma cooking bacon in the kitchen. That was when I came out of my room and went back to the living room. Fast forward about 2 years later, my great-granddad is dead, I'm a bit older, and I kept having dreams about the tall one that I saw that one night. I had these dreams somewhat often, and every time, I woke up in a cold sweat, usually unable to sleep for the rest of the night. The dreams were most frequent shortly after the first encounter, and every night for 4 nights in a row before the second, which I now detail. The second time I saw him, it played out much like the very first. I got out of bed sometime around 2-3 am, and went to the kitchen to get a Dr. Pepper this time, instead of water. Around 3/4 of the way down the hall, I remembered what had happened that night, and I instantly froze. I could feel them close again. I could feel the aura of wrongness that I had originally felt right before the first time I saw them. I tried to turn around and sneak back to my room or my great-grandma's, or my grandparents who had come to live with us after the death of my great-granddad. I couldn't turn around though. I felt absolutely compelled to continue into the living room. It was like I didn't have a choice. But I suddenly felt very okay with the idea, like I was calm despite what I knew was going to happen to me. Sure enough, in the living room was the tall one, but he was already facing the entrance to the living room, where I was walking from, and he was unaccompanied this time. He also didn't smell this time. There was no smell, but I could hear a faint humming that sounded like it was coming from outside. We lived near a highway, so it could have been a car, but it didn't sound like one. He knew I was there, and I'm pretty sure he was the one that calmed me and forced me to come into the living room. He seemed much more approachable this time, but he did the exact same as before. He studied me for a moment with a small smile, and then put me to sleep with his hand. Again, I woke up on the couch. When I woke up, I felt less horrified about what happened, and more curious as to why, and I remember distinctly feeling like I was trapped by fate into seeing him multiple times, like I was sure it would happen again, whether I wanted it to or not. Throughout the years, I never distinctly remembered meeting him again, but he did appear in my dreams. I moved twice, and he was still there every 4-6 months. Sometimes it was a singular appearance in my dreams, other times it was up to 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night after I had had the 3rd dream, I stayed up at night, sitting in the living room of my new house, waiting to see him, but I never saw him. Instead, I woke up still in the living room, but upside down against my couch, with my legs up in the air, my upper back on the floor, and my lower back resting on the edge of the couch cushion. Several blankets were haphazardly spread around me, and my underwear was around my knees for some reason. I guess he knocked me out before I was able to see him, and he did. Whatever he does. In all this time, I still have no idea what he actually was doing or why it was me. I still was very unnerved every time he was in my dreams, but I was less surprised. I haven't had a dream about him in nearly 2 years now, but I am posting this because I recently had a dream with a different entity. I'm pretty sure it was one of the smaller beings that were with the tall one on the first encounter. He was a very stereotypical small grey alien, wearing a dull red, almost maroon cloak. He greeted me, and, long story short, we wound up talking about a lot of things. He told me about the eventual fate of the world succumbing to environmental issues if we don't stop pollution. He told me of the countries of the world forming superpowers, eclipsing most smaller nations, one of them being formed from the US, the other from Russia, and 1 or 2 others coming from Australia and its surrounding lands, or maybe somewhere a short distance off the coast of southern Brazil. I'm not 100% sure, but I do remember the ones about the US and Russia. I then asked him if he could share any technological information with me, and he said he could, but it would be limited, and he was only permitted to show me a few things. I asked him for a source of limitless power, and he drew up this diagram for me. It struck me as an electrical diagram of some sort, but I knew that it made no sense, so it may be something else entirely. It was a bit ago, so I can't be 100% certain of the exact diagram, but that's as close of an approximation as I can get. Maybe try hypnosis of some form to recall it better. I do know, however, that some sort of diagonal resistor-like symbol was in that location. There was some type of bulb-looking structure on the right side, although it may be inverted as compared to what's in the picture, and I know there was a series of boxes with overlapping lines on the left. So, that ends the tale for now. I sort of await my next encounter, as the hooded one in the dream did tell me we would meet again. Can someone please tell me if they know what the diagram might be of? Any thoughts on my experience? I really want to know what's been happening. I may not have been able to completely convey what happened, as this was typed in a hurry, but if you have any specific questions, do ask.